How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin by Rudyard Kipling. Once upon a time, on an uninhabited island on the shores of the Red Sea, there lived a Parsee from whose hat the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the Parsee lived by the Red Sea with nothing but his hat and his knife and a cooking stove of the kind that you must particularly never touch. And one day he took flour and water and currants and plums and sugar and things and made himself one cake which was 2 feet across and 3 feet thick. It was indeed a superior comestible. That's magic. And he put it on the stove because he was allowed to cook on that stove, and he baked it till it was all done brown and smelt most sentimental. But just as he was going to eat it, there came down the beach from altogether uninhabited interior one rhinoceros with a horn on his nose, 2 piggy eyes, and few manners. In those days, the rhinoceros's skin fitted him quite tight. There were no wrinkles in it anywhere. He looked exactly like a Noah's Ark rhinoceros, but of course much bigger. All the same, he had no manners then, and he has no manners now, and he never will have any manners. He said, "How?" and the Parsee left the cake and climbed to the top of a palm tree with nothing on but his hat, from which the rays of the sun were always reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the rhinoceros upset the oil stove with his nose, and the cake rolled on the sand, and he spiked that cake on the horn of his nose, and he ate it, and he went away, waving his tail to the desolate and exclusively uninhabited interior which abuts on the island of Mazandaran, Socotra, and the promontories of the larger equinox. Then the Parsee came down from his palm tree and put the stove on its legs and recited the following sloka, which, as you may have not heard, I will now proceed to relate. Them that takes cakes, which the Parsee man bakes, makes dreadful mistakes. And there was a great deal more in that than you would think, because 5 weeks later there was a heat wave in the Red Sea, and everybody took off all the clothes they had. The Parsee took off his hat, but the rhinoceros took off his skin and carried it over his shoulder as he came down to the beaches to bathe. In those days it unbuttoned underneath with 3 buttons and looked like a waterproof. He said nothing whatever about the Parsee's cake, because he had eaten it all, and he never had any manners then, since, or henceforward. He waddled straight into the water and blew bubbles through his nose, leaving his skin on the beach. Presently the Parsee came by and found the skin, and he smiled one smile that ran all around his face 2 times. Then he danced 3 times round that skin and rubbed his hands. Then he went to his camp and filled his hat with cake crumbs, for the Parsee never ate anything but cake, and never swept out his camp. He took that skin, and he shook that skin, and he scrubbed that skin, and he rubbed that skin just as full of old, dry, stale, tickly cake crumbs and some burned currants as ever it could possibly hold. Then he climbed to the top of his palm tree and waited for the rhinoceros to come out of the water and put it on. And the rhinoceros did. He buttoned it up with the 3 buttons, and it tickled like cake crumbs in bed. Then he wanted to scratch, but that made it worse. And then he lay down on the sands and rolled and rolled and rolled, and every time he rolled the cake crumbs tickled him worse and worse and worse. Then he ran to the palm tree and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed himself against it. He rubbed so much and so hard that he rubbed his skin into a great fold over his shoulders, and another fold underneath where the buttons used to be, but he rubbed the buttons off. And he rubbed some more folds over his legs, and it spoiled his temper, but it didn't make the least difference to the cake crumbs. They were inside his skin, and they tickled, so he went home very angry indeed and horribly scratchy. And from that day to this, Every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all on account of the cake crumbs inside. But the Parsee came down from his palm tree, wearing his hat, from which the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor, packed up his cooking stove, and went away in the direction of Orotavo, Amygdala, the upland meadows of Anantarivo, and the marshes of Sonaput. This uninhabited island is off Cape Gardafui, by the beaches of Socotra and the pink Arabian Sea, but it's hot, too hot from Suez for the likes of you and me, ever to go in a P&O and call on the cake Parsee. The end. How the Camel Got His Lump by Rudyard Kipling. In the beginning of years, when the world was so new and all, and the animals were just beginning to work for man, there was a camel, and he lived in the middle of a howling desert because he did not want to work. And besides, he was a howler himself. So he ate sticks and thorns and tamarisks and milkweed and prickles, most excruciating idle. And when anybody spoke to him, he said, "Humph," just humph, and no more. Presently, the horse came to him on Monday morning with a saddle on his back and a bit in his mouth, and said, "Camel, Camel, come out and trot like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the horse went away and told the man. Presently, the dog came to him with a stick in his mouth and said, "Camel, oh camel, come and fetch and carry like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the dog went away and told the man. Presently, the ox came to him with the yoke on his neck and said, "Camel, oh camel, come and plow like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the ox went away and told the man. At the end of the day, the man called the horse and the dog and the ox together and said, "Three, oh three, I'm very sorry for you, with the world being so new and all, but that hump thing in the desert can't work, or he would have been here by now, so I'm going to leave him alone, and you must work double time to make up for it." That made the three very angry, with the world so new and all, and they held a palaver and an indaba and a punchiet and a powwow on the edge of the desert, and the camel came chewing milkweed most excruciating idle, and laughed at them. Then he said, "Humph," and went away again. Presently, there came along the djinn in charge of all deserts, rolling in a cloud of dust. Jinns always travel that way because it is magic. And he stopped to palaver and powwow with the three. "Djinn of all deserts," said the horse, "is it right for anyone to be idle with the world so new and all?" "Certainly not," said the djinn. "Well," said the horse, "there's a thing in the middle of your howling desert, and he's a howler himself, with a long neck and long legs, and he hasn't done a stroke of work since Monday morning. He won't trot." "Woo," said the djinn, whistling. "That's my camel, and for all the gold in Arabia. What does he say about it?" "He says humph," said the dog, "and he won't fetch and carry." "Does he say anything else?" "Only humph, and he won't plow," said the ox. "Very good," said the djinn. "I'll humph him if you will kindly wait a minute." The djinn rolled himself up in his dust cloak and took a bearing across the desert, and found the camel most excruciatingly idle, looking at his own reflection in a pool of water. "My long and bubbling friend," said the djinn, "what's this I hear of your doing no work? with the world so new and all? Humph, said the camel. The djinn sat down with his chin in his hand and began to think a great magic, while the camel looked at his own reflection in the pool of the water. You've given the three extra work ever since Monday morning, all on account of your excruciating idleness, said the djinn, and he went on thinking magics with his chin in his hand. Humph, said the camel. I shouldn't say that again if I were you, said the djinn. You might say it once too often. Bubbles, I want you to work. And the camel said, Humph, again. But no sooner had he said it than he saw his back that he was so proud of, puffing up and puffling up into a great, big, lolloping humph. Do you see that? Said the djinn. That's your very own humph that you've brought upon your very own self by not working. Today is Thursday, and you've done no work since Monday, when the world began. Now you are going to work. How can I, said the camel, with this humph on my back? That's made a purpose, said the djinn. All because you missed those 3 days. You will be able to work now for 3 days without eating, because you can live on your humph. And don't you ever say I never did anything for you. Come out of the desert and go to the 3 and behave. Humph yourself. And the camel humphed himself, humph and all, and went away to join the 3. And from that day to this, the camel always wears a humph. We call it hump now, not to hurt his feelings. But he has never yet caught up with the 3 days that he missed at the beginning of the world, and he has never yet learned how to behave. The camel's hump is an ugly lump, which well you may see at the zoo, but uglier yet is the hump we get from having too little to do. Kiddies and grown-ups too woo-woo, if we haven't enough to do woo-woo, we get the hump, Camellia's hump, the hump that is black and blue. We climb out of bed with a frowsly head and snarly-yarly voice. We shiver and scowl, and we grunt and we growl at our bath and our boots and our toys. And there ought to be a corner for me, and I know there is one for you, when we get the hump, Camellia's hump, the hump that is black and blue. The cure for this ill is not to sit still or frowst with a book by the fire, but to take a large hoe and a shovel also, and dig till you gently perspire. And then you will find that the sun and the wind and the djinn of the garden too have lifted the hump, the horrible hump, the hump that is black and blue. I get it as well as you, hoo-hoo. If I haven't enough to do, hoo-hoo, we all get hump, Camellia's hump, kiddies and grown-ups too. The end.